So this is the second portion of the textual analysis, or the historical arc in the historical program that we're going to go through with respect to osteopathy, and looking for emergent themes with the lens of epistemology, ontology, and axiology, or the philosophy of science. We're looking at the early literature and trying to understand what early osteopathic practitioners displayed as far as their belief in what is true, what is real, and what their values were. Now, obviously, we want to go and do that, but first, we want to maybe go through a little bit of a story with respect to the author or the individual that we're going to look at today. Now, the individual we're going to look at, we have a slide about this a little bit later, but what we're going to do is discuss the works of Elmer D. Barber. Elmer D. Barber was the first person to publish a book on osteopathy. This didn't really sit particularly well, because if you're the person who first coined a term, first brought a profession off its feet, first started a school, and one of your students is the first ones to write a book on the subject, you may not be all that happy. And it would seem that Dr. Andrew Taylor Still was not all that happy with Elmer Barber, especially because there were illustrations. So essentially Elmer Barber's book seems to be, or at least his first book, seems to be class notes from what Dr. Still taught him and his wife, with illustrations and the whole bit. So there is some story that kicks around out there that subsequent to the production of this book, Dr. Still banned the taking of notes when he was teaching. So he couldn't take any more notes, and that was primarily because he was upset about the production of this book. So the first book came out in 1896, and Dr. Still's first book, the autobiography, didn't come out until 1899. So Dr. Still was very much beaten to the punch on writing a book or producing a book on osteopathy. The subsequent things that happened was that Elmer Barber and his wife opened a school in Kansas City. I believe it was in Kansas City. So what ended up happening is there was accusations that that school was a diploma mill. So Dr. Still didn't like that. He didn't like the fact that there could be diploma mills with respect to the profession of osteopathy. He ended up sending William Smith. Now, William Smith was trained at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Scotland, and I don't remember if his teacher was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or no, I think his classmate was Conan Doyle. But either way, there is some claim that William Smith was one of the inspirations for Dr. Watson. So what ends up happening is Dr. Smith gets sent up to Barber's school to pretend to be looking for a diploma. Now he goes, and Barber says, okay, we'll take a look at what you can do. Smith shows him what he can do, shows that he's a competent practitioner, so Barber gives him a diploma. That leads to the claim that that's proof that it's a diploma mill, because Smith didn't go through any education, but he got a diploma. Barber's counter to this in legal proceedings was that Smith was clearly competent, and he proved himself competent, and with the evidence that Smith was a previously trained practitioner, he should have the ability to access a diploma based on competency. So as I noted, there was legal proceedings, because what ended up happening is the Still family went after them to try to shut their school down, went after Barber to try to shut the school down. So there's back and forth with legal proceedings, and the way that they finally kind of shut Barber down is Barber seems to have been operating a school in Kansas City, but had a charter in Kansas. Now, Kansas City is in Missouri. Kansas is just a very short distance away, right? So it seems that he was operating with a charter from another state, which is not above board. It's not the appropriate procedure. So school got shut down. Then the subsequent things that happened, it seems that Barber was obviously very harmed by this, and the claim is that he drank, I think it was some form of acid, essentially to poison himself to commit suicide. So this just highlights not only who Barber was to some degree, one of the earliest graduates from the American School of Osteopathy, the first producer of a book on osteopathy, a school operator who ended up getting tied up in some challenging things. Now, the reason that I've titled this presentation the Pariah is because Barber was not obviously looked well upon by Dr. Still and the Still family, and there was some drama between them, which we just kind of outlined, just to add some color to the presentation. So what we're going to do is take a pause here, and then we'll move on through to go back to our primary work, which is analyzing the actual textual references, the textual evidence, to see the emergent themes. So as a simple and quick review, as we turn back to our primary aim with this work, we just want to review the terms that are going to drive our textual analysis or constrain our textual analysis. So epistemology is a theory of knowledge or theory of knowledge creation, aka what can be known, right? How can you know it and who can it be known by? So a theory of how you create knowledge. So it's the constraints through which knowledge will be created or can be created. There isn't one way to do this, there are several, and we've outlined those. So very broadly, positivism, post-positivism, and constructivism if we're going from one end of the spectrum to the other. Right? Positivism being a belief in a singular reality that can be identified through appropriate experimentation. Post-positivism believing there's a singular reality that can be approached through multiple methods of experimentation. However, the researcher is a limiting factor. Constructivism believing that there are many realities that are entirely dependent on the individual, their previous experiences, and the environment of observation. So essentially, one reality versus many realities on a proposed spectrum. Ontology is your classification system. So ontology philosophically is the study of reality, but in the scientific method, it's how do you classify reality to examine it. The axiology is the value or values of the researcher, or the value or values of the person speaking in this case, or writing in these cases. So we're looking at these works through these lenses to try to identify emergent themes so that we may better understand the viewpoints and, as we said, the view of knowledge, or the view of what's true, the view of what's real, and the values associated with those. So as a refresher from looking at Dr. Still's books, we're going to talk about the emergent themes, so just so that we can kind of frame where we are, because this is a progression, because this is a qualitative approach to analyzing data or analyzing these texts. What we're doing is iteratively going through them. We identify the themes in the first book, and we're trying to see if those themes change with other texts or if they remain somewhat stable. So just to touch on the emergent themes from Dr. Still's books: high degrees of confidence in an objectively uncertain set of circumstances. So Dr. Still would say, I'm going to tell you what I know to be true, right, through all my years of experience. So if you're looking at a human body from the outside and you're saying that these sets of symptoms or these sets of signs definitely mean that this thing is happening inside where I can't possibly see it or understand it better, that's an objectively uncertain set of circumstances, but you're being very certain. Now, to be fair, in that time frame, you didn't have many ways to be much more certain, so it's not that the certainty is unplaced or miscontextualized, because in that context, you could more easily make claims like that and nobody could disprove you. Now we have more abilities to remove some of that uncertainty with varying blood tests, varying images, and other technologies, right? So to just be fair, that Dr. Still's certainty was not out of its place or out of its time. However, as we look back on it with our views and our abilities, it is uncertain. So a high degree of prejudice against pre-existing modes of healthcare. Again, to be fair to Dr. Still, although he was prejudiced against other modes of healthcare, there were times where he did say some positive things about them. No consistent epistemology, so no consistent framing of how knowledge is created. There are some that were constructivist, or some claims of knowledge that were constructivist, some claims of knowledge that were positivist, and it seems that there may have been some that might be better argued to be post-positivist, although those terms didn't exist in those frames for Dr. Still at that time. However, we can use those as lenses to examine what he said. Some signs that ontology is based on what would today be termed functional anatomy, right? So we know Dr. Still would say things along the lines of, this thing is happening, I see these signs, that means that this structure that I cannot see is doing this thing, right? So it's mostly tracing functional anatomy. So when a movement is different, then it would relate to this area, which means it relates to these things. Confidence in uncertain situations and the prejudice against pre-existing modes of healthcare do seem to suggest an axiological preference for individual empiricism. So I don't believe what the other people said, I believe what I see and what I interpret, right? So that puts you more on the constructivist end. So what I see, what I experience is empiricism because I'm seeing it and experiencing it, but I believe that more than what other people tell me because I have to be more right because I'm using functional anatomy to view these things. So it's using individual empiricism, but also a constructivist lens. I construct the knowledge, I am more right. So those seem to be the emergent themes so far from Dr. Still's books. So as we already noted, the texts that we're going to be looking at are from Elmer D. Barber. The first text being Osteopathy, the New Science of Healing from 1896. That was the first osteopathic book published, or at least that's the first one on record. Osteopathy Complete from 1898. So 2 works by Barber, and we'll go through them. There's probably going to be a fair amount of redundancy in the quotes because we're looking for the theme. So in looking for a theme, redundancy is helpful because you're not seeing shifting off of the theme. So you examine a bunch of things and provide those examples so that you make a firmer case for how you're interpreting it. So this first passage is fairly lengthy, and it's from the preface of Osteopathy, a New Science of Healing, the New Science of Healing. So it's a larger passage, so I will read it, but the aim here is to pull out the themes again. So we next heard of Dr. Andrew T. Still, who was effecting cure after cure in marvelous manner upon, as he claimed, scientific principles. We visited the old doctor, were convinced that he discovered the fundamental principles on which were based the results accidentally reached by others, and entered his school of osteopathy, from which we graduated March 2nd, 1895, with an average grade of 99 in anatomy and physiology and 100 in osteopathy. So he's speaking about himself and his wife. So at least based on Still's teaching and assessment methods, or the assessment methods and teaching of Still and those he was surrounded with, which weren't many people at the time in 1895, the Barbers did fantastic, right? So I'm just taking a small break from the passage to inject that. Okay, returning to the passage, while it is our desire to give Dr. Still credit for the new science which he discovered, we must differ with him as to the true cause of the results reached by the osteopath. While a good doctor believes that nearly all diseases are caused by dislocated bones, nearly always finding them and thereby winning for himself the name of bone doctor, in our practice we never find a great number of dislocations, and by the same manipulation effect the same cures as Dr. Still. So just to exit the passage for a moment, the first book on osteopathy is disagreeing with Dr. Still as far as fundamental etiology. They're saying that Still's methods are great, but they just don't agree with the etiology or the cause that Still claims. They see other things as maybe more consistent in their observation. So you have essentially a separation of observation. So Barber observes, Still thinks he's seeing bones as the problem, or bone dislocation. Barber's saying, we seem to disagree. Okay, so to return to it, if a bone is really dislocated, has been in that condition for years, the dislocation cannot be reduced. But if the muscles are contracted, causing a stiff joint or depressing the ribs, they can be quickly relieved by manipulation, and the patient is easily led to believe that the bone was dislocated. To exit the passage for a moment, Barber saying that in his experience, so this is a constructivist thing, this is based on individual empiricism, the things that he is noticing is that a truly dislocated bone can't be reduced, especially if it's been that way for a while. But he finds a lot of changes in tones of muscles. Use the methods that Dr. Still prescribes, and that seems to be the thing that's more effective. So we have a disagreement in the observation of what's going on, but you have the method working over and over again, right? So while we do not doubt for an instant that our classmates are sincere in their belief that in catarrh, sore eyes, deafness, and other disease of the head, the atlas is dislocated, and that they cure these diseases by setting the atlas. We believe that twisting, pulling, and stretching the neck in vain In a vain attempt to move the atlas stretches the muscles, thereby freeing circulation, permitting nature to assert herself. Be they right or wrong, our readers can cure any acute disease in the head almost instantly by gently pulling on the head and rotating it in all directions, and any chronic complaint, except cancer, total deafness, or total blindness, by continuation of the same method. We all agree upon the one great point, that man is a machine, and that nerve centers have been discovered upon which a pressure of the hand will cause the heart to slow or quicken its action, from which we can regulate the action of the stomach, bowels, liver, pancreas, kidneys, and the diaphragm. The thousands of people snatched from the grave by an application of, first a, well, I don't know how, that must be some form of typo, or maybe I'm misreading it, but anyways, of some were never failing principles, are proof positive that at least the keynote has been struck, that at last man is found and a school established that can explain intelligently why certain manipulations produce certain results. So the credit that he's giving Dr. Still is the methods seem to work. It is a very organized manner in which this is put together, but the underlying cause less clear. There's some disagreement there. Still based on individual empiricism. Also, you're seeing the idea of being highly certain. So being highly certain that you can go to a certain area, put your hand on it, and regulate the kidneys, right? So I don't know how in that manner you would figure it out. You would have to have related symptomatology or change, and then you're not necessarily considering the time frame properly, but at the time that this was said, it's not out of place, it's not out of context, but in today's viewpoint, we can say that they were highly certain in uncertain circumstances. And that the idea that you can know functional anatomy well enough that you know where to go to know how to control these things. So you're seeing that theme of functional anatomy being the ontology or the classification system. So we classify diseases based on the anatomy as it relates to functions, the functions that are in some form of change, right? So maybe another way to make that a little more clear, the anatomy isn't doing what it's supposed to do, therefore there are related symptoms, and we can track those or classify those based on functional anatomy. So the next quote, again from Osteopathy, the New Science of Healing: "It is a well-known fact that cold will contract not only iron and steel, but the muscles of the human body. To prove our theory is correct, allow a cold draft of air to strike the neck for a short time, and possibly the next morning you have a stiff neck. Why is that? Why is it that the head does not turn freely on its axis? Because the muscles that were exposed have contracted and are a little too short. Acting on these principles, we trace consumption to the contracted muscles of the chest, and which are forcing the elastic ribs down upon the pleura and lungs. The old idea that as the lungs decay, the ribs settle. How absurd to imagine that the soft, spongy lungs can support the chest. As well, that a house full of sponges would hold up the roof." So there's a few things going on here. One, again, we're seeing the classification of diseases through functional anatomy. You're seeing a high degree of certainty, saying that because we know that cold can contract steel, that it's going to contract a muscle. So you're seeing a simile there, but it's being asserted as a positivistic truth. We definitely know this is definitely sure. Whereas it's not the same thing. The contraction of a muscle in relation to a change in temperature is understood in different ways. And then to connect that to consumption, which I do not remember, I believe that may have been pneumonia, but I'm not 100% sure about the interchange of terms from that time to this time. But anyways, that a cold draft on your neck is going to create some form of nameable disease process in the lungs. So they're saying that that's definitely the case, it's very certain, and then also being somewhat ridiculing previous ideas. So this isn't necessarily aimed at a particular profession, but it does show prejudice against other ideas, or ideas other than functional anatomy is the appropriate classification system to identify the cause of disease processes. So we turn to another quote from Barber: "We have established the fact, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that it is the steady pressure of the contracting muscles that causes this dread disease, and experience has taught us that until tuberculosis sets in, it can be cured." Okay. Very, very certain statement in uncertain circumstances, because we now know that they didn't understand the process of something such as tuberculosis in the way that we do now. We can also fairly competently say, if we're honest, that we may have a very good understanding of something like tuberculosis or other disease processes, but we can admit that maybe our understanding is not as full as it could be. Our understanding will evolve. So it's not fair to simply rag on people in the past for their not understanding what we understand today. We can see the evolution of the understanding, but what we can say is there's, as a theme, high degree of uncertainty here, also doubling down on the concept that it's a contracted muscle of some sort. So there's the difference between Still and Barber here again, and saying that we've established this fact. Now, if you look at the book at large, the manner in which they would have established this fact is, I saw it over and over again, my individual empiricism, I've interpreted my findings through the classification system and the lens of functional anatomy, so I'm definitely sure. There's no attempts to disprove this. There's no appropriate scientific method applied to this. It's a very firm claim. So it's a constructivist claim based on individual empiricism as interpreted through the lens of functional anatomy. And there's a difference between Barber and Still, as noted here again, muscles instead of bones. So they still believe in the same classification system, functional anatomy. They still both believe in individual empiricism. They just maybe disagree on the particular details. So now we turn to a quote concerning atrophy or shrinking of muscles. Atrophy of any part might well be mentioned at this time, it being a form of paralysis. It will be remembered that we mentioned the fact of the nerves controlling the caliber of the arteries, thus regulating the blood supply. In atrophy, we are confronted with a condition in which the nerves controlling the arteries which feed the withered parts are interfered with. The wires are down and the cry of hunger from the starving muscles never reaches the brain. So, very strong statement based on the knowledge that was present at the time. So essentially you have the idea of constriction and dilation of vessels, but particular arteries in this case, and saying that it's based on the nerve centers, right? So we now know that there is some neural control of the caliber of the vessels, but blood flow is much more auto-regulated in a local sense, and there's disagreement about the particular mechanism there. So another way to say that is that arteries are going to change themselves based on local conditions. So if you squish a given area, the artery will respond in some way to that. It's not centrally controlled, it's peripherally controlled, and it's peripherally controlled in the local area of change. So arterial blood flow is quite good at getting to where it needs to go, regardless of condition, because it has mechanisms that are not directly mediated centrally. They are peripherally, but more so locally regulated. Again, as I said, there's some disagreement about the mechanism with this. It does seem to center around calcium, but whatever happens, you change the condition in that local area, the artery responds appropriately. So again, very firm statement, based on the information that was had there. So contextually, it's not unfair to say what Barber's saying, but we understand it a little bit more now that this claim is not as accurate as it could be. But again, individual empiricism based on functional anatomy, right? So you have the same themes coming over and over again, and also a constructivist claim, an individual empiricism claim, sounding like a positivist claim. So he's essentially making this sound like no matter who looks, they're going to agree with me, and that's obviously not the case. So the next quote is cause. We will now endeavor to prove to the satisfaction of our readers that viewing man as a machine, constipation can be traced to its true cause and cured by an application of the never-failing principles of osteopathy. The digestive organs in constipation may be compared to an electric car with the current partially cut off. With a light load, it might possibly work in a feeble, halting manner, while the slender wire transmits the power to move the heavy car. The dynamo generates that power, break the connection, and the car stops. So is the human being. The brain is the great generator, the center of all power. Stop for one instant. The current on these slender nerves and the heavy muscles of the giant are weaker than those of a tiny child. There is one peculiarity about the nerves, which is liable to lead one astray, and that is the fact that a pressure on the main trunk of a nerve causes no pain at that point, but at the extremity of the nerve. So this, again, high degree of certainty, this is definitely the case, is the claim. So it's a positivistic claim based on interpretation of what they've seen through individual empiricism and basing that on functional anatomy. Now, let's just take the case of somebody in a coma. Right now, somebody in a coma still maintains quite a bit of function. Obviously, people in comas are more likely to survive now because we can provide external help. But even very superficially, with respect to compression on a nerve, deeply changing its function, you really need to talk about how much pressure, how much time, right? So if pressure on a nerve was truly a problem and it wasn't built to take it, at least to some degree, me doing this, just this, should make me pass out, right? So if this claim was true, that pressure of me turning my head over this way and putting compression on the nerves and the vessels here, I should pass out these nerves, and then also because of how the cord is composed, basically this should make it hard for me to move my legs, if this claim were as true as it says it is. There may be some degree to which this claim can be considered to have insight, but you have to consider time frame, you have to consider how much external pressure, how long, right? So as I noted, time frame. This is a very firm claim that doesn't hold up even to the superficial sniff test if you can think maybe in another way, right? So as you bend your elbow, right, because of the compression here at the elbow, my hand should go numb, right? Now, I may be able to do this for a very long time and my hand may not go numb. Now, I can do it for a longer time with more pressure and my hand may go numb. So we need to consider more things. So there may be some insight contained within this concept, but it's not as true as it would like to frame itself. So turning again to another quote to further highlight these themes. In corroboration of this view of the subject, we may advert to the fact that all the cases of uterine displacement met with in our practice, with the single and rare exception of such as are produced by violence, occur in females who suffer from the very circumstances which are most efficient in inducing muscular relaxation of these parts, as constipation, piles, dyspepsia, nervous debility, mismenstruation, abortions or miscarriage, preternatural labors, etc. So just want to turn back or pull out of the quote for a moment. You get evidence of the fact that this is based on what they've seen, so their sample is limited by themselves, and this is individual empiricism. So it's a constructivist truth parading as a positivist one. The simple point, let me get to the right spot. In corroboration of this view of the subject, we may advert to the fact it's the met within our practice. Met within our practice. That's the particular phrase in this paragraph that is of extreme importance because it tells you how they've collected the data, or it points in the direction of how they likely collected the data. So it's a constructivist truth, individual empiricism, interpreted through functional anatomy to make the claim. This is not a positivist claim. This is not everybody's going to look at this and agree, because we know that not everybody's going to agree with this claim, at least at this time point. It's a well-known fact that all cases of female troubles are accompanied by a weak lame back, and it is to this point that we trace the real cause of most cases of falling of the womb and other troubles peculiar to women, either by an accident or overwork. The muscles of the back, from the first lumbar vertebrae to the last sacral, have become strained, causing contraction and consequent pressure on the nerves which control the organs of generation, thus breaking the nervous current from the brain to these parts, interfering with the circulation and permitting the muscles which hold. So the quote continues, and we don't absolutely need to continue it, but a well-known fact. The question is, a well-known fact by who? Do all people agree with it? I would say that even at this time, not all people agree with it, so to claim that as a singular, observable, consistent truth that everybody would agree with, regardless of who it was, is not a fair thing. So again, individual empiricism, right? So constructivist claims parading as positivist claims happens again. So I'm obviously not going to read the entire index. However, the index stands as at least some sign that for the purpose of communication in the environment that these people were in the environment that Barber was in, and other osteopathic practitioners at the time, what they've done is they've imported disease classifications from the allopathic world, and they're going to use that as a classification system, right? So you have the classification system of functional anatomy as how we understand and how we categorize what's going on. But what they've done is, for communication purposes, they import the allopathic disease classifications. So what they're going to do is take those disease classifications and then marry that or join that with functional anatomy. So they'll say asthma. You're going to find it in this portion of the lesions in this portion of the vertebral column, maybe these particular ribs on the right or the left, depending on who you read, because some books will say it's these ribs on the right, some books will say it's these ribs on the left, and that's how you start to identify that this is individual empiricism. This is constructive or constructivist in its nature. It's what I've seen. It depends on me. It depends on my patients. So that's how you can start to see that if you look back at other historical texts and the particular claims of where the mechanical problems live in relation to these diseases. But what they do is they import the disease classification, they join that with the explanation of functional anatomy, and then there you go. So the primary classification system is functional anatomy, but they'll then overlay that and map the disease classifications to that. So now we flip over to Osteopathy Complete to see if these themes are somewhat stable within Barber as an individual. So in presenting Osteopathy Complete to the student and practitioner, we feel that we are entering a field comparatively new and upon which very little has been written. The word osteopathy, signifying bone disease, is a misnomer and is itself misleading. It was coined by the discoverer of a few of the fundamental principles of this new science of healing. The human system is, to all intents and purposes, a wonderful machine capable of running for an indefinite period of time unless interfered with by accidents, dislocations, contraction of muscles, obstruction of nerve force, or the circulation of the nutritive fluids of the body. Heart is compared to a double force pump, driving the blood through the arteries or irrigating channels which pervade the most hidden recesses of the entire body, the veins collecting it from the capillaries and returning it to the heart. So a ton of functional anatomy talk there. So functional anatomy is the only way to understand disease. That's what's going down. The brain is compared to a dynamo which generates and transmits by way of its nerves the forces which control and give vitality to every tissue and organ of the body. Again, functional anatomy. Osteopathy is based upon a thorough knowledge of anatomy and physiology and enables the skilled operator to reduce dislocations by mechanical methods to keep free the wonderful forces and nutritive fluids of the body so essential to the true physiological conditions, and that its methods are efficacious in the treatment of many diseases which have baffled the skill of almost all other methods which have been tried and proven to be of no avail, can be attested by thousands who have been restored to health and usefulness by an application of its principles. So there's an interesting thing that happened there. The patients will tell you it works, right? So there's the beginnings of the concept that the patient experience, the patient report, has a high degree of value, right? With an earnest desire to advance the cause of osteopathy and place it before the public in its true sight at the request of students and practitioners, we have thrust aside the veil of mystery in which it has been shrouded by its discoverer and its associates. So that's a shot at Dr. Still. I'm going to write a book because they're trying to keep this a secret. Such standard works as Gray, Landois, Saunders, and Musser, which should be in the library of every osteopath, have been freely consulted. So importing the concepts of others outside of osteopathy. So there is some degree to which Barber points at osteopathy being the best, but we're going to import other concepts for communication purposes. The author has endeavored to be accurate, concise, and modern, and to merit in the future the firm support and encouragement received in the past. We are deeply indebted to Dr. Helena M. Barber for many valuable suggestions, also to Dr. Stanford T. So that's just kind of an unnecessary preamble for what we're doing. So functional anatomy is still there, and also some degree of prejudice against other systems, but importing their concepts for communicative purposes. So again, another fairly long quote here from Osteopathy Complete, but it has a decent amount of meat in it for the purposes that we're analyzing. So osteopathy is a progressive science and is yet in its infancy. Valuable discoveries are being continually made by skillful members of the profession while engaged in research and experiment. So that's individual empiricism, to some degree at least. This is making it sound more like it's positivism. So these people are looking for these things and they're finding it, it's all these different people. But in this case, the general theme seems to point in the direction that that's more individual empiricism. I'm seeing it from my patients, so this is what's true. It does not claim to cure all the ills the flesh is heir to, neither would it presume to detract from the virtues of any other method of healing. So this is where there's a softening of the prejudice. There is still some belief with Barber when you read through that osteopathy is the best, but he is less prejudiced against other professions, right? So he says he's essentially saying they have their place, we have our place. We're the best, but they all have their place. Its necessity to a large extent due to the fact that the oldest and most general method of practice has had since the 16th century some of the most intellectual men of the world engaged in research along the lines of its theory, and still claims to have discovered and presented to the world but three absolute specifies for the elements of humankind, and the efficacy of these has not yet been attested by the experience of the subjective patients. So another thing that is of note, again, the patient report, the subjective does have value. So it's an axiological statement with respect to Barber here. While osteopathy does not expect to entirely supplant materia medica, its merit has already been established beyond any pre-adventure, and no other method of healing has in so short a time made with such rapid strides into public favor and confidence, which is entirely due to its remarkable record, which although the majority of cases treated were termed chronic and had previously tried almost all other methods without result of a cure, shows about 90% of the cases treated benefited, 75% completely cured, and while only 10% received no relief, and one injured or made worse. So you don't know where he's getting this data, but he's making this interesting claim. We do really good. And also, we seem to do good with chronic cases. The evidence that he had at the time was pointing more to chronic cases because these other patients had told the practitioners they tried everything else, and now osteopathy is doing what I needed to do. All right, so I don't know that there's going to be a ton more in this quote. I've obviously pulled it out in its totality to try to demonstrate it, but I think the point is demonstrated with what we've already kind of gone through. So individual empiricism again, he's less prejudiced against other professions, still saying that we're the best. So there's some prejudice, we're the best, but the other ones deserve their place. And the patient report matters, the subjective patient experience and what they tell us. They're saying we're awesome, so woohoo. So within this quote, we have a lot of specifics, right? Very specific claims, of which probably was a reasonably cutting-edge level of knowledge at the time, but he doesn't tell you where he got it from. I think there's a possibility that it implicit in making these claims, right, or writing this down, that if you're consulting the books that he said to consult in his opening, that you would be able to find it on your own, right? So not as much citation at the time, but here we go. Free circulation of blood. It is conceded by all leading authorities that a normal circulation of blood is one of the most important functions of life, and it can hardly be more forcibly demonstrated by the fact that in a normal condition, a quantity of blood equal to the entire amount in an ordinary human being passes through the heart about every 30 seconds. The blood represents about 1/12 of the body weight and normally is distributed about 1/4 in the liver, 1/4 in the muscles, 1/4 in the heart, lungs, and large vessels, and 1/4 in other organs. So that's at the time, having no way to measure blood in a living specimen appropriately, this was probably findings from autopsy. Probably, I can't make that claim extremely firmly, but I can say that that's more likely how they would make the claim of 1/4, right? And also the assumption that everything's going to get exactly what it needs, because, I mean, why wouldn't it, right? It has to get the blood that it needs when the blood's working properly, when the vascular system's working properly. Each tissue gets the appropriate amount of blood. We think it's fair to say that we now understand that it's a more complicated system than that, and it's more complicated to make a claim like that. It is composed of serum, a nearly colorless liquid, and red and white corpuscles. Chemically, it contains proteids, fats, sugars, salts, and hemoglobin. Corpuscles represent about 40 to 45% of its total weight, and there are about 14,506. About 14,506. That's a very specific number to say about. Anyways, white corpuscles to 5 million of the red in each cubic millimeter, the proportion varying in different conditions in health and disease. The red corpuscles have definite life and degenerate as do other parts of the body. The white corpuscles have the power of amoeboid movement, by which they are able to pass through the walls of capillaries and surrounding tissues. They have their source of origin in the lymph glands and spleen, and some of them end in red corpuscles, while others take part in the inflammatory processes being sacrificed in pus formation. So that's not a terrible understanding of what we would understand now. So this, you can see kind of the beginnings of this, but very leaning into other authors, leaning into other sources for very specific information, while not citing it, right? So high degree of certainty is understandable when this is the cutting edge of information that you have at the time. It would be nice to see maybe a little bit more communication of uncertainty, saying this is the best we understand at the time, instead of saying this is definitely true, right? That's, now that may be my preference as an individual, but I can say that with most of the things that we're aware of now, we know that we need to know more. So the final quote that we're going to look at, again, looking at the level of certainty and mapping that onto the consistent theme of individual empiricism. So making a positivist claim but really it's a constructivist thing, right? So this theory is strongly demonstrated by the fact that two individuals may be exposed to an infectious disease at the same time, and one may contract it while the other does not, which is owing to the difference in the physiological condition of the two systems. So that's not necessarily an unfair statement. Individual variation is quite normal, so two people exposed to the same stimulus will respond differently. Returning to the quote, in one case there was free circulation of blood rich with leukocytes or white blood corpuscles. The eliminating processes were active, thus giving the system the power of resistance, or in other words, it was physiologically normal. In the other case, the circulation of blood was sluggish and perhaps deficient in the white blood corpuscles. There was no doubt glandular inactivity and impaired elimination, thus giving the system no power of resistance, or in other words, it was already in a pathological condition. So, not unfair to say individual variation in response to the same stimulus. Somewhat unfair to say that it's definitely because there was mechanical restriction, or point in the direction that there was mechanical restriction to the vascular system. This leans into the quote that we had previous about, I definitely know the most cutting edge stuff about this blood, and when this blood is in its normal state, its healthy state, that means that it's mechanically normal, or the system is mechanically normal. So functional anatomy being your interpretive lens, individual empiricism. So I see two people exposed or in the same situation, and one of them gets sick and one doesn't. I examine them, and of course the one, or maybe I don't examine both of them, but I examine the one who got sick, and of course I find movement problems. Right now I will say that it's very unlikely that you will find completely symmetrical movement in any living human, or in any living specimen rather, because there are not known any specimens, or at least I don't know of any specimens that are actually measurably symmetrical. almost all living specimens are somewhat asymmetrical. So you should expect to chronically find some variation in motion, especially in paired structures. So to say that, to ascribe mechanical dysfunction to normal variation in people, or the normal variation in people exposed to the same stimulus and their responses being different to mechanical dysfunction, may be a bridge too far. So that's another demonstration of high degrees of certainty in uncertain circumstances. But again, to be fair, contextually, there was less opportunity to examine this in a different light, so this could have been considered cutting edge, but it does still place itself as a positivist claim developed in a constructivist way through individual empiricism as interpreted through functional anatomy. So now that we've gone through all those quotes from Barber and had the discussion, the themes do seem fairly stable between Barber and Still. Now, it would be fair to argue that because Barber was very early on in the profession, so the American School of Osteopathy opened in 1892, Barber was a student in 1895, it would be expected that the themes would be somewhat stable because there was much more direct contact between the two gentlemen. Now, we just want to ask the question, do the themes, the emergent themes hold steady? And as I already noted, they seem to. So there's obvious disagreement about details. Still says it's more about dislocations of bones. It depends on, what you mean by dislocation, but Still says it's more about the bone. Barber says it's more about the muscles, and how both of them would say that the dislocation of the bone or the contracture of the muscle affect the other structures. So the object of attention is a little bit different, but they agree on the major things, right? So inconsistent epistemology. Now, the things that showed up in the quotes primarily point to individual empiricism. So I'm looking, I'm seeing it, this is what I'm identifying consistently over and over again. There's no consideration of possibly having a homogeneous population. In other words, the people that Barber was seeing may have all lived extremely similar lifestyles, right? Still would likely have seen people who were living very similar lifestyles, so that can lead to similar types of presentations. There's no consideration of that. The majority of the quotes from Barber suggest positivism, or an attempt at positivism. So he has a positivistic worldview, but he's developing it with constructivist methods. I've observed this, right? And the truths do depend on him. So that's somewhat consistent with the quotes that we've pulled out, or that theme is consistent. However, he's got a positivist worldview, but he's doing it in a constructivist way. So, and also then he leans into others, so he does lean into the quote about blood, or the constituents of blood. That would be a positivistic thing, because that would have likely been done much more through lab work. The claims about the distribution of blood in the body would have been done through autopsy, so that would have been done through a consensus building process. That would have been more positivistic. So he likes positivism when it's useful, but to prove himself, to prove his knowledge and his belief, he's making positivistic claims. These are observable by everybody, but really he's doing it off of only what he's observed. So we still have that inconsistent epistemology. The ontology is built through functional anatomy, plus disease categorization. So as I said, disease categorization is important from other professions for the discussion, but what they do is they map on the functional anatomy to explain the disease process. Again, the lower degrees of prejudice against pre-existing models of healthcare, it's still present. Osteopathy is the best, but the other professions have their place. They do have value. And then there is some evidence of empiricism is valuable with concomitant evidence that it is more than just the individual, right? So the osteopathy is very young. It's hard to have a broad data pool at this point. So individual empiricism does make sense. I'm seeing it, and then I talk to my friends, and this is what they're seeing. So the individual empiricism does make sense. But the other thing that I didn't write down, but I will inject into this portion, is the idea that the patient report is very important. The subjective experience of the patient has value as well. So axiologically, individual empiricism is very valuable. Axiologically, prejudice against other professions less so with Barber than with Still. And then the individual empiricism, as I said, it makes sense contextually, but it doesn't, in hindsight, doesn't deserve the high degrees of confidence that it presents. But contextually, it makes sense.